And more technologies. TDI. So I would not consider myself a Bridgerton fan, but I did watch both seasons, and I just started the Queen Charlotte spinoff thing. And the amount of poor or lack of communication reminds me a lot of some of the theories you've been talking about. Food for thought as you're thinking about applying artifacts. There's a lot of communication and relationships and a variety of contexts that might be appropriate or relevant. So welcome back. Hope you're doing well and happy Friday. Today, we are getting into another new theory. This is a theory that, again, moves us into a bit more of a group and organizational context. So today's theory is organizational culture theory. Organizational communication is a pretty big subfield in communication studies. It is very closely tied to business, marketing, public relations, and it's about how organizations and groups such as companies, institutions, nonprofits, et cetera, are able to communicate and engage both internally and also externally in terms of how those types of groups reach the public. So if we think about, for instance, major nonprofits such as UNICEF or the Red Cross, right? Those are utilizing skills in organizational communication. So last class, we took some time to talk about groupthink. Groupthink, of course, referring to the way in which when we find ourselves in group settings, we self-censor. We don't share what we really think. We share what goes along with the group in an effort to avoid conflict, to make smooth sailing, and to try to make managing those situations as good as possible. But in doing so, we don't allow people to speak openly, express their disagreements, and a variety of problems can happen. Ravidi did a great job of talking about the Challenger explosion, right, which killed over 7 astronauts, drastically set back NASA and their space exploration because they tried to rush it out the door. They didn't give the time to really test and make sure that things were working properly, and there was a lot of pressure from leadership and executives. We also looked at the Stanford Prison experiment as another example of how the experiment continued in an incredibly inhumane and hurtful way until Zimbardo's girlfriend came in and was like, what the heck is going on? This is awful. This needs to stop. So the idea of group members working together is tied to cohesiveness, right? This is an important element, that groups are very cohesive, they're very connected, and in that interconnectedness, they're able to solve problems. So today, we'll be looking at organizational cultural theory. We have some examples here that we'll be looking into, and then we have Lily, who will be giving a presentation in just a little bit. So organizational culture theory, right? So this requires us to understand a couple different things. First of all, organizational communication, how groups, entities with some element of structure communicate. It's a bit of a square rectangle situation, right? A small group could be an organization, for example, like a board of directors or a team for a small business or company. But not every small group is an organization. If, for instance, you're part of a team in a larger company or group, then that would not be considered organizational communication. So this is how organizations communicate internally and externally. And we can understand this through what's known as a cultural lens. So if you've taken a communication course before, there's a good chance the topic of culture has come up. We also have an intercultural communication course. We can get into those ideas in more detail. And there's a good chance if you take advanced code, psychology, sociology, et cetera, that you have taken some account of culture and cultural role in the process. Culture referring to the ways in which our perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences create a set of values, beliefs, and practices that are shared, that are practiced, and that are exhibited through communication. So putting those two things together is kind of unexpected because a lot of times if we think about an organization, it's a lot more kind of quantitative, it's data driven. It's like, how does that organization like utilize algorithms to communicate effectively through social media? That's how we talk about organizations a lot, right? But instead, the use of culture is a useful way to understand how organizations behave, act, and are structured. So this takes social cultural, organizational, and interpretive hermeneutic approach. So we're seeing a shift right now, since we're about the midpoint of the term, from a lot of theories that have been positivistic and empirical. That is, they lay out specific principles, things that can be measured, things like axioms. We're shifting more toward theories that are not as easy to quantify, but they are describing human experience. So the methods that are being used are looking a little bit different. We'll see a lot more theories coming up in the next couple of weeks that use interpretive and hermeneutics. So just know that this is about how we make sense of meaning. It's using things more like qualitative data to understand things. So if you're like me and you're a nerd, you might be familiar with video game company Valve. They made a lot of famous games such as Portal, Portal 2, Half-Life, Half-Life 2, and a number of other very popular titles, Team Fortress 2. They're very well known for making a variety of different games. One thing that makes them really kind of interesting is how their organizational structure and management style is actually really unique and is facilitating the way that they go about designing games. So we'll talk a little bit about them as an example of organizational culture. A lot of other examples we might think about, like tech companies, such as Apple, and some of the unique ways that these companies are structured and organized. Of course, there's things to critique as well about organizational culture, like toxic, destructive, or hurtful organizational culture too. So it doesn't mean that it's necessarily positive, it just means that it's unique. So organizational culture theory has a few different assumptions here. Communication is about how we use symbols to convey meaning. We talked about this in the very beginning of the term, right? In other words, we create a sense of shared reality from our experiences as people. In the same way, as members of an organization or group, together we shape organizational reality. What is this organization or group designed to do? What are its aims? What are its goals? How does it reach the public? If you're a nonprofit and you're advocating for things such as providing increased support for people experiencing home and houselessness. You're supporting veterans with PTSD, right? The members of that organization work together to create the structure of the organization and how that organization achieves various tasks. Okay? And in order for an organization to create a culture, to create a community, it has to use interpretation, it has to use symbols to create a sense of culture within that group. We think about some examples of some really popular television series. I'm thinking specifically about The Office, Parks and Recreation, right? A lot of the fun in watching those shows is seeing how there's like a community by the various employees working together, right? So, Dunder Mifflin, Michael Scott, there's a very specific culture among the people in there. The Pawnee Parks Department, right? That's also very structured and cultured. So there's a lot of mediated examples that you could look at for an application paper about how various organizations are represented. So a lot of different examples you can draw from there. And cultures, cultures vary across disciplines and interpretations of actions or diverse. In other words, cultures are very different in how they understand human experience and issues. How one organization or culture is choosing to address an issue is going to look very different than another one. For instance, if it's a cult, it might have a very different interpretation of COVID-19 than the World Health Authority. So this theory comes from Clifford Geertz, Michael Pnowski, and Nick Donald Trujillo. These are three scholars who are interested in sociology, communication, and utilizing communication to understand elements of cultural experience. In particular, I want to highlight Clifford Geertz. If you're taking communication research methods with me, I think that's a couple of you. We're taking a little bit of time to talk about ethnography, but Geertz is very well known for ethnography in developing many of the ways that we use ethnography today. Ethnography being the study of culture and the means of studying culture by participating in studying and taking field notes on the culture or group itself. So Clifford Geertz has a famous piece in which he went to Bali and he took an extended period of time to understand and analyze and take field notes on the practice of Balinese cockfighting, right? Which, depending on your perspective, might not be especially ethical, but is a very major element of Balinese culture that he was interested in exploring and understanding the cultural ins and outs of. And through that kind of rich analysis, his research was in many ways looking at the development of culture and identity. So useful context to bring into our discussion about culture and how culture manifests itself in groups. So what organizational culture theory gives us is a means of understanding how organizations behave. This is relevant to us whenever we find ourselves working, whether we're working at EOU, we're working for some type of company or group, we're part of a club or activity that involves some element of structure. And organizational life is characterized by change, right? The idea is that, especially in the context of COVID, the changing social political landscape, and actually right now, 2023, right, changes with things such as AI, ChatGPT, and similar things that are coming out, that's drastically changed organizational life. Like some employers are straight up cutting positions because they think that AI can fill in the gaps and do that instead. Or some employees are using this technology to develop and integrate materials. So, organizational life is changing a lot. You might be familiar, there's a book in kind of business and marketing called Who Moved My Cheese, right? And it's a metaphor to describe how if cheese moves in a maze, some people are responsive to that change and adjust what they do. Other people don't. It's a very sink or swim attitude. COVID-19, right? A lot of businesses were drastically impacted and many were forced to adjust to a very different landscape. So the scientific lens is limited. That is purely using a kind of data-driven approach. Let's take the numbers, let's quantify this. Doesn't get at the nuances of how organizations behave or act, according to this theory. And lastly, an organization itself is a culture. That is, an organization develops a sense of culture or identity. If you're familiar with the phrase, we're like a family here, describing an area of employment or organization, right? It's about developing a sort of sense of community. Now we can critique that, and we can critique the kind of use of boundaries and the way that a culture is developed within an organization, but just to say that over time, an organization develops an identity, a history that impacts our membership in it. The metaphor of a web, I think, is a really good way to think about organizational culture theory, right? If we think about like a spider web, an organizational culture is kind of like a set of shared beliefs and practices. In the same way that the different kind of weaving of the web, the different parts connect to each other and form a cohesive whole, there's a lot of different parts, such as shared beliefs and practices, that make the web overall function. So for example, maybe your club or organization, you do meetings every week. Sometimes you do meetings outside if the weather's really nice. Sometimes if people at a game, you get taken out for dinner. For some reason, you always end up at the Quality Inn whenever you're traveling for a competition. So there's a lot of examples here about how your organization or group, like it's a club, or perhaps you're involved in some type of employment where the kind of space, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, has a variety of events. So there's a lot of things that are shared in that group. Just like a web, right? It's fun to watch spiders from a distance making webs because, the wind kind of blows them and changes the web around a little bit. Sometimes a bug gets in and messes up the web a little bit, right? The spider has to go in and they have to fix the web. They have to fix kind of the weaving of it to make sure that it's structurally sound. And in the same way, right, the web has to be maintained, it has to be reinforced. Maybe you had a really major person in your organization who left and you're trying to fill in that gap. You can't replace them, but you can celebrate them and you can find somebody who is also able to kind of carry the torch, right? So maybe the president of your student club has graduated and you're looking for a way to maintain and reinforce the culture of the group. Again, I love to go on the example of speech and debate. Whenever we traveled for speech and debate tournaments, we'd stand in a circle and we'd do a whole bunch of silly vocal warm-ups and tongue twisters, your Sally sells seashells by the seashore, all that stuff. And one thing that we developed as a culture was that like students would bring in their own tongue twisters and warm-ups, and then people who had graduated, their warm-ups would continue to be done by the next generation. So a colleague I worked with at the University of Utah, where I coached for a few years, loved to send me videos of the team doing the warm-up that I brought, and to see that still in action. So it's fun to see like the kind of history and culture that's developed. And just like the web, right? Sometimes you see it, sometimes it's got dew and you can see the web very clearly. And other times you like walk right into the web and you're flailing around and worrying that a spider got it. So a web can be both seen and unseen. Some of the elements of culture, organization, and structure are not things that we think about or that are really being represented. But if we look between the lines, we understand some of the nuances of how the group works. We start to understand how the web is being created and used. For example, right, you see this a lot with organizations that ask people to come into an office or space. Why are they doing that? Why are they having like various awards or events? Why are they doing something like a potluck or some type of social event, right? That you might not think has a point, but is designed to kind of develop the organizational. So when we're talking about culture, right? Culture is kind of this practice of shared values, beliefs, traditions that are passed down, that are shared, that are brought between people over time. So pictured here are confederated tribes of Eastern Oregon, right? So we have Walla Walla, Cayuse, and Umatilla, who occupy and have occupied the historical land here. And every year they present at Pendleton Roundup. We also have a powwow every year where they're involved as well. So the practice and sharing of cultural tradition is a key element here. Culture is connected in an organizational context to productivity. How do you all get things done? How do you work? How do you accomplish tasks? Perhaps there's a lot of groups and delegating. Perhaps you use a very structured email chain. One other way of thinking about this is if you work somewhere that's physical, how's the office set up? Is it something like an open plan where people don't really have assigned cubicles or spaces, but instead they have this large shared space to work together? Or is it much more siloed and compartmentalized? For example, I work upstairs and we have a small group of people who have various rooms, and we're like the less raucous and loud area on campus for faculty. So that shapes the way that we communicate and work together. Competition, who are the competitors? Who is our organization up against and working with? And how do we cater what we do to respond to those things, especially if you're in some type of advertising, marketing, and so on, right? Things like ChatGPT and Bing are in many ways in competition with one another. So how are they selling themselves? Autonomy. So how does an organizational culture respect the autonomy or boundaries of people? Perhaps you have kind of very flexible travel opportunities for people to leave if needed. And then lastly, cooperation. How do members of an organization work together to achieve outcomes and goals as a group? So if we think back to symbolic interaction theory, right, the use of the pi symbol to represent 3.14, 159, et cetera, is how we use symbols to convey reality. In other words, the values of the organization are in many ways represented through the symbols that they use. So one way of thinking about this is to think about the slogan or logo that a company or organization uses, and also to think about like their iconography, right? So if we think about, for example, Nike, right? The famous swoosh, just do it, right? That kind of describing the very active, oriented style that they like to use to promote their products. Running shoes, athletic wear, trying to get people outside, just do something or accomplish a task, whatever it is very much tied to the organizational culture and logo. Think different was used really in the past to describe Apple, right? Talking about the sort of out of the box mentality that they had. There's a lot of other examples that you think about here too. REI, which you might know, does a lot of kind of outdoor and sportswear. They have a practice called opt outside, where instead of doing Black Friday deals, right, they encourage people to go outside and their store is closed. But that's actually a marketing strategy to get people to buy products and to market themselves ahead of Black Friday. So it's interesting to see some of the practices organizations do kind of make their brand, make their identity, and the way they express their identity known. So as mentioned, ethnography from Clifford Geertz, the idea of deep play. It's about being deeply involved, understanding, and really kind of going into the culture or background of a group of people. It involves a lot of qualitative studies, including those of organizations. So one way that it's useful here is to ask yourself, how do we understand and know about organizational culture? Well, we go in and we study the culture and we study what that culture is doing. So we understand the performances, the practices, and things that members of that culture do. For example, Bear Creek Salmon Festival and the kind of celebration and recognition of salmon is something that a lot of Indigenous communities in Eastern Oregon pay a lot of attention to and really represent in cultural practices. So the rituals that members of an organization do, whether the day-to-day tasks, what does it look like, right? Again, if we think about a show like The Office, the entire show is set up like a documentary, right? Where it's like people are going in and they're interviewing and the various employees and they're trying to understand what's going on there. So it's literally doing an ethnography of The Office to understand the culture and background of that. It also involves the passion. What are the things that people are interested in? What do people do? The social and political context. What organizations are involved in various issues? How do they engage in public relations and strategy to reach larger audiences? What are the values and beliefs that are represented or respected within the organization or group? And enculturation, how do people become new members of that group? One kind of extreme example are universities with Greek life, right? Fraternities and sororities oftentimes will do some type of enculturation or ritual to have people become members. Sometimes it's very safe, other times it's very dangerous. So the kind of hazing rituals that happen to new members, or maybe giving like new members of a group a harder time because they're new and they're trying to be put in the group, that can be at times a negative practice that happens. So this theory, organizational culture, has a few different critiques. One of them is that it's not necessarily consistent. That is, if you ask the CEO of a company, what is your organizational culture like, right? They're probably going to say something very positive. They're going to speak very much to the benefits of the organization, the things that they do well. You ask somebody who is working and has dealt with perhaps harassment or discrimination at work in that same company, they're going to have a very different story to tell. So there's not necessarily one shared culture or experience among everybody, but the perspectives of people within that group matter a lot. And organizational culture theory sometimes misses the nuances of the fact that one person's experience in an organization is very different than another's, particularly across kind of social, political lines. It's important for us to think about how difference shapes people's understanding. It's also, of course, coming from more social and ethnographic traditions. So we're going to be looking at, again, a lot of theories that are more interpretive. They're not necessarily about quantitative data, but about qualitative material. And while that material is very valuable, very important, I do a lot of research in that material, right? It can't necessarily be generalized as easily, right? So there are challenges in explaining how some of the findings from organizational culture theory can be used in a broader context. One of those challenges, of course, is in qualitative research. The bias of the researcher in terms of the subject they've chose, the reasons that they've studied the subject in the way that they have, do shape our understanding of this, right? So it's a useful theory, but as we'll see with a lot of the interpretive theories, right, there are some challenges there. And in the same way, right, a lot of empirical and quantitative theories have limitations because they give us numbers, they give us trends, but they don't necessarily explain behavior in the way that qualitative work does. So that's why the mix of the two different approaches is really useful to gain knowledge of learning, because they're offsetting each other's weaknesses. That's actually why a lot of research that you might see now is using what's considered to be mixed methods, or a combination of qualitative and quantitative work. So we will have our class presentation of the day, getting more into organizational culture theory and some of the elements of organizational culture. You're welcome to click or use the arrow keys as you're working through.
Do the right one.
So right one moves you ahead, and then left moves back.
Okay. So I did organizational culture theory. And just like a quick reminder, organizational culture theory is composed of beliefs, expectations, and shared by members of the same organization. And organizational culture consists of like common norms, values, beliefs, and of the individuals like within that group. And then according to the text, it talks about how organizational values include stories, goals, practices, and it is looked at through a cultural lens. The article I looked at was by Denise Lee Yuan. It was from the Harvard Business Review, and it just was like a broader understanding of like organizational culture in companies. And just like where they start is from like the higher ups, like the CEO hires HR, and HR is usually like responsible with human resources. They're usually responsible for like the well-being and the culture within an organization. They usually agree on a mission statement and the values that they want within the organization. And from there, they figure out how they want to contribute to the bigger picture of it and how they can get their employees to, I guess, understand and work together. And they were thinking on like employee perks, such as giving them free snacks, even just like celebrating birthday parties, just connecting with their employees. And then afterwards, they want to evaluate the effectiveness of the organizational culture and like if they're doing their part to contribute to the bigger picture. I think a big part of culture that was also talked about in the article was changing cultures, because like times are always changing and so is culture. A big example is COVID-19. COVID-19 did change a lot of different companies' cultures and affected how leaders interacted with their employees. They affected company values, even just like not even working with directly with coworkers can change a whole company's organizational culture within it. And then with losing jobs and people in positions, your energy and goals get redirected. In the article, it talked about how people behave and like their attitudes and beliefs. And it's like compiled of a bunch of like social norms and like the way people interact with each other, even just like in a workspace. And something that the article quoted was, or I quoted from the article, is the way we do things around here is an example of how people interact with each other daily, or even just like designated breaks or lunch rooms. And it talks about an order of organizational culture. It talks about how a board of directors is usually the one that like compiles the organizational culture they want within the company. The CEO is the one who defines it. Human resources department is the one who usually offers the training or like even programs, determining the effectiveness of how they can get to their organizational culture that they want. And then the risk department, it focuses on monitoring the employees closely and making sure that they're also they're following, I guess, protocol or what is considered a social norm with organizational culture. And then managers are the direct, I guess, supervisor of the employees. And I think a big part that this article talked about was that everyone plays a part in organizational culture. So organizational culture can't just come from the top to the bottom. Like if the employees aren't complying with it, then there is no such thing as I guess, a functioning organizational culture. And ways that companies can manage the desired culture is using like agenda setting, engaging in conversations that talk about like what they can change or do better. And then reviewing like the feedback from employees that eventually gets to like higher up. And then it talks about how each group is like responsible for their part in organizational culture. And an example is like that the article talked about is if they wanted to do like a customer centric culture, this would include hiring like a whole new person on to the team to like refocus their energy towards creating a different culture. Like I talked about, COVID-19 culture has to like keep up with changes, and even just getting promotions can change like the whole organizational culture of a company, because different people go into power all the time. And then how it connected to like the reading, it talks about how organizational culture in a company is usually like a chain of command that usually starts from the top and goes to the bottom, and then almost like bounces back with like the way people are reacting to the type of culture within a like company. And then it talks about how it's like organizational life. It kind of reminds me of like worker bees, like everyone has like a big part in like what they want like the outcome to be. And then I learned that organizational culture is always changing. And I think COVID-19 was a great example of that. And it also goes hand in hand with social norms and like what we consider to be like typical or like regular behavior within a company, or even just our education and school systems. Like everything has its own type of educational or organizational culture. And then I also learned that it starts from the top. So it usually starts with a core set of values or beliefs that we want to be like displayed or see within employees or students. And these are my sources.
Thank you so much for sharing, Lily. This term is actually the first time we've done this style of presentation to ask folks to bring in like an outsider fuller example, and I've been really impressed. I think these have really added a lot to each of our classes talking about these theories, and I really enjoy seeing them, right? Because we can talk about these theories a lot in the abstract, we can talk about them in a kind of detached way and explain the fundamentals, but seeing how it's used, seeing how it's applied, and like seeing it in context, I think is really rich and valuable for us. Now that we understand the fundamentals of the theory, like how is this theory actually being employed? How can we actually use the theory in the world? And I've really enjoyed seeing these presentations get into that. There were a lot of really excellent points that were brought up from Lily's presentation in the outside article. One of them being the way that kind of from the top, like a CEO or president or leader of a group is in many ways dictating the organizational culture and structure. For example, if we think about like the US president, well, they have an entire cabinet, they have chief of staff, secretary of state, press secretary, right? They have a whole cluster of people that oftentimes changes. And of course, the Oval Office, typically every president comes in and they like will redecorate it, will change the rugs, will change the structure. If we think about this in other contexts, Eastern Oregon University will be hiring a new president, right, who will be taking on the reins this next year. And that's going to drastically change the direction we're going, right? So what is the leadership or vision that president is bringing? It's going to impact how they communicate with us, what they do. So that plays a really big role too. So oftentimes somebody is coming in a leadership capacity with a vision or a perspective on what they want the organization to look like. You can almost think about it as trickle down, right? So trickle down economics has been heavily discussed and critiqued, that the idea of starting at the top means that wealth will go to the group. But if we think about it as the culture or the expectations start at the top, there are ways that that culture might or might not be reflected as it works its way down to other employees and members of the group. And then another point that I thought Lily did a great job of pointing to is how sometimes people in a group are hired or new employees are brought in an effort to change, revise, modify, or somehow adjust the organizational culture. That is to say that an organization or group might not have an optimal culture. Perhaps morale is low, perhaps they're not able to successfully achieve certain tasks, but the hope is that by bringing somebody new in, they can change and add like wind in the sails, like maybe a new coach who's coming in with a lot of enthusiasm and engagement. That's a double-edged sword, because on the one end, right, injecting new blood can help a group become more effective, and it can really help to address issues. But the organization is also structurally constrained. That is to say, somebody comes in and they have limits, they have history, they have constraints within the organization. You can't expect somebody to come in and just like change everything overnight, right? So the quality of the experiences and background of people in shaping the organization matter, but there's also constraints to think about. So I want to look at the application of the video game developer Valve. Again, if you play games such as Portal, Portal 2, Half-Life, and so on, you might know them pretty well. They're known for very quickly acclaimed, popular, and in many ways kind of out-of-the-box types of games that ask you to think in new and kind of unique ways. The premise of Portal being that you have this like portal gun where you get to like teleport and solve puzzles using that. What's really unique about Valve as a company, though, is their organizational structure. That they don't typically have managers or boss or hierarchy in the way that we might expect in other organizations. And they've cited this unique kind of organizational structure and layout as one of the keys to their success. By opening up people's ability and decision-making authority among employees in the group, it's opened up a greater number of ideas. Pixar actually has a similar system in which they essentially allow every employee to present ideas, and a lot of the leadership will sift through and look through various ideas that employees have presented to figure out what type of film they're working on next. So I wanted to share a clip from Valve that gets into some of their organizational culture. And this video is presented as an application to how organizations or businesses could use these principles. For our purposes, I think it's useful for us to understand how elements of organizational culture seep into this organization's decision-making.
In an MBA, what you can learn from Valve's employee handbook. If Valve's employee handbook is required reading for every MBA program, then it should be. This successful company, think over 3 million copies of their game Portal 2 sold in 2 months successful, operates with no managers, no bosses, and no required scrum meetings. Instead, each employee makes decisions, chooses their projects, and uses their talents to make the company successful. Here's what every manager should learn from the Valve handbook. 1. Leverage strengths. The Valve handbook says employees should ask themselves, what leverages my individual strengths the most? When you are divvying up responsibilities on a project, focus on your own strengths and your team. Leverage strengths rather than trying to mediate weaknesses. According to a Gallup poll on workplace satisfaction, employees are happiest when they're doing what they do best at their job. 2. Talk to people all the time. The Valve handbook says to find out what's going on, you should follow 4 steps. Talk to someone in meetings, talk to someone in the elevator, talk to someone in the kitchen, talk to someone in the bathroom. At your own company, don't wait to be recruited. Go out and find great projects for you and your team by talking to people in the company. 3. The best team structures happen organically. On the point of team leads, the Valve handbook says, project teams often have an internal structure that forms temporarily to suit the group's needs. Rather than always assigning project leaders, let your task team structure itself on its own. Unlikely leaders with new innovative ideas are more likely to pop up. 4. Hiring is your most important choice. Reports vary, but a bad hire can easily cost your company tens of thousands of dollars. A bad hire is wasted training, and they will also bring down the rest of your team, showing productivity and profits. You're better off hiring contract workers for busy times and only hiring full-time when you find that perfect person. At Valve, the company handles all hiring decisions with the utmost attention, the handbook going as far as to say, hiring well is the most important thing in the universe. Nothing else comes close.
So, in kind of looking at this, a lot of organizations and groups, they'll have like a handbook, they'll have, maybe a company Bible that goes over the practices and behavior, right? And then looking at this example, right, the way that employees are asked to communicate, they're asked to form informal groups with each other, they're asked to engage in task and decision-making, and also the role of hiring, right? What is the talent that we're recruiting? Where's that talent coming from? We're seeing a lot of applications of these ideas surrounding organizational culture, right? Another point that I think Lily brought up really well that's connecting in a contemporary way has been COVID and has been the context of remote work, right? A lot of jobs were moved remotely in COVID, and right now we're seeing a bit of a split where some organizations and groups say, yes, we will continue to offer this remotely. For example, a lot of government jobs in the state of Oregon have remained remote because they hire talent from outside of the state, people who are well qualified, who they want to continue having work the job. While other companies or groups have had a very strong push toward returning to a physical space, returning to the office, returning to a commute, but things have changed for a lot of people. Maybe people now have kids. Maybe people live somewhere very different. Circumstances have made it very difficult to engage in organizational culture with these shifts. And so we're seeing a lot of kind of concern and pushback about what is and isn't remote, how culture is developed in the context of remote work, and how perhaps the organization's goals to create a company culture might be in tension with the experiences of workers and their background too. So a lot of things for us to explore and to look at here. So I'm going to have us do, in the context of some of these topics, is I'm going to have us work in groups. And what I'm going to ask each group to do is to pick another example of an organization with perhaps a unique culture or structure to it. And how does this group use symbols to communicate and create its sense of an organizational culture? To change up the partnership just a little bit, we'll do it by rows this time. So we'll do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6 with these first 2 rows up here. We'll do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in that second from the back row. And then we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 among folks in the back row. So find a space to work together, have one person write or type for attendance to find an organization or group that you find has a unique culture.
I tried to do it. It's an exciting. Yeah, who wants to? So,
What's that?
Does it have to be like unique?
If there's something that's standing out or that you want to share, you're welcome to do that.
I'm thinking specifically like in the like how like if there's more than one person doing it, you know, it's not really.
yeah. Most indie games are just kind of having projects, and I think you actually get a payout. And then they blow up or don't.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have a structure. I have a social. Just like. Yeah, but I put down that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm at. Just like.
Visual novel, for if you're like trying to hire.
Outsourcing.
Yeah.
Uh, like a real. What's the actual thing? Represent something.
So take a couple more minutes to continue your discussion.
Yeah. I feel like there is a benchmark. I know again.
So take another minute on sharing, and I'll ask each group to share in just a second.
Yeah, I had to look it up. Solar creators and the first actual company. There's an indie game.
So let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that you all discussed and worked on together. So I'm going to ask each group just to share what they chose and some of the elements of organizational culture that they noticed. Let's start with the group in the back.
So we did a Google
Mhm.
and kind of like it's like what they do, like you get like a symbol like throughout the month and holidays, different little things like the Google like logo, like kind of like the relating things going around the world.
Yeah.
And then we said like in like organizational culture things like I feel like it's like very welcoming, like it's kind of the biggest thing in the world. So, like I feel like they welcome like most ideas that employees bring up. I feel like you got a little bit smarter with them. Not gonna be like higher qualified with this.
Sure. So sometimes organizations like Google, they have kind of a very unique interviewing and application process that can be very competitive and challenging. And when we combine kind of their employee structure and also the way that they communicate publicly, it creates an image, and that image impacts what people think about when they apply and consider it too. So the outside image can also shape the kind of internal structure of the group. How about this middle group?
We went with Southwest Airlines.
Uh-huh.
And basically, if their employees are happy, their customers are happy, with the profit, shareholders are happy. And like there is the goal in the heart because they said like that's like the heart of their people is like their company.
Yeah.
And like I feel like every like market is like really happy to spot to like go through your airlines and see that your services are fine and like a verbal and like a verbal work symbol. And then I was like it's really interesting because like there's like personal experiences like when you find that dictate like your
employee and customer service.
Mhm.
And then it's social because you have to interact with all playing and like flying. And then just making sure we're like stakeholders and just like the experience, like organizations, make sure that all.
The public relations and marketing, right, is playing a big role. What do the things immediately come to mind? What are the things that come to mind when you hear about this company or group, which is in many ways reflecting what that company wants externally and also within its own structure? And then how about in the front?
One thing that we picked was the idea of like indie game development.
Yeah.
And how the team structure is rather unique because it's just a bunch of people, bunch of creators kind of in a basement trying to get something done for little to no pay until it actually creates a product, which can create this unique kind of natural culture and organization in which there's not really a structure aside from just trying to move forward and encourage each other.
Yeah. Can confirm my co-creator that I've talked to for about 15 years from Canada, composes music, and I do much more of the graphics and design and stuff. And yeah, the elements of kind of this more informal structure and punctuation are things we see in groups. I think that what these examples really help point us to is that what we think about externally as people who think about the organization matters a lot, which also shapes who comes in and the kind of perspective on the inside. Those two things can look very different. Something can look very rosy and nice on the outside, but be a disaster to work in culturally and vice versa. But the kind of public and private elements of groups and organizations are important elements that a lot of organizations have to manage to help us understand this theory in a bit more practice. Thank you all for sharing. So to wrap up, we talked about organizational culture theory, the elements of organizational culture and structure. After the weekend, we'll return on Monday, and Britt will be talking to us about rhetoric. So get ready for that. Please email or pass forward your group's attendance. Make sure your group member names are on it. Have a great weekend. Enjoy whatever the heck the weather decides to give to us this weekend. And I'll see you on Monday. Thank you.